we begin with more of those powerful, heartbreaking calls to action on gun violence, with survivors and family members of victims from recent mass shootings testifying before Congress today. We heard from Zanetta Everhart, the mother of 21-year-old Zaire Goodman, who was wounded but survived the mass shooting at a Buffalo grocery store last month, which was motivated by racist hate. She described her son as pure joy, while calling the person who shot him a domestic terrorist, saying domestic terrorism occurs because America is inherently violent.
My son, Zaire, has a hole in the right side of his neck, 2 on his back, and another on his left leg, caused by an exploding bullet from an AR-15. If, after hearing from me and the other people testifying here today, does not move you to act on gun laws, I invite you to my home to help me clean Zaire's wounds so that you may see up close the damage that has been caused to my son and to my community.
We then heard from Dr. Roy Guerrero, the only pediatrician in Uvalde, who described the horror that he witnessed 2 weeks ago in the city's emergency room.
2 children whose bodies had been pulverized by bullets fired at them, decapitated, whose flesh had been ripped apart, that the only clue as their identities was a blood-splattered cartoon clothes still clinging to them, clinging for life and finding none. I could only hope these 2 bodies were a tragic exception to the list of survivors. But as I waited there with my fellow Uvalde doctors, nurses, first responders, and hospital staff for other casualties we hope to save, they never arrived. All that remained was the bodies of 17 more children and the 2 teachers who cared for them.
Dr. Guerrero knew these children. He knew their parents, too. The first wounded child he saw was Mia Cerrillo, the 11-year-old student who had smeared a dead classmate's blood on herself to trick the shooter into thinking she was dead. During his testimony, the doctor called her Sweet Mia. Mia, who saw her classmates killed that day, also testified via video.
Shot my teacher and told my teacher goodnight and shot her in the head. And then he shot some of my classmates and the whiteboard. I thought he was going to come back to the room, so I grabbed the blood and I put it all over me. And
what did you do then when you put the blood on yourself?
Just stay quiet, and then I got my teacher's phone and called 911.
And finally, we heard from the mother of Alexandria Lexi Rubio, a 4th grader who was among the 19 children killed in Uvalde. In video testimony, sitting next to her husband, Felix, Kimberly Rubio made this tearful plea days before she would lay her precious daughter to rest.
I left my daughter at that school, and that decision will haunt me for the rest of my life. We understand that for some reason, to some people, to people with money, to people who fund political campaigns, that guns are more important than children. So at this moment, we ask for progress. Somewhere out there, there is a mom listening to our testimony, thinking, I can't even imagine their pain, not knowing that our reality will one day be hers, unless we act now.
Today, U.S. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced that the Justice Department will review the law enforcement response to the Uvalde shooting and will make its findings public. As for the response in Texas, well, that's less clear. Texas Senate Democrats are calling on Governor Greg Abbott to convene a special legislative session to raise the age to purchase long guns to 21 and to require a universal background check. The governor is the only one who can call a special session and set its agenda. Instead, Governor Abbott wants the Texas legislature to form special committees to make legislative recommendations in response to the shooting, which critics say is too little and far too late. But check out the special sessions called by Governor Abbott before to enact restrictions on abortion and transgender student athletes, banning vaccine mandates, limiting fake critical race theory in schools. It's essentially a bingo card of Republican boilerplate. But when it comes to guns, children, and their safety, nothing. Joining me now is Texas State Representative Jasmine Crockett, who is running for U.S. Congress, and Brandon Wolf, press secretary for Equality Florida and a Pulse nightclub shooting survivor. And Brandon, thank you both for being here, first of all. But Brandon, I want to start with you because I watched the testimony live this morning and cried through the whole thing. I will unashamedly admit. And I myself couldn't imagine how anyone could watch that and walk away from it completely moved and inspired to act to prevent this happening again. But not everyone had the same reaction. I want to play for you Representative Andy Biggs of Texas, who has whimsically spoken about lynching and not in a negative way, and who has a certain history in his politics. But this is what he said. This is how he reacted to watching that testimony. Take a look.
I got to tell you, the most egregious thing that the Democrats did today is they took a young person, little Mia, who was traumatized 2 weeks ago, still suffering under obvious PTSD as she testified in that video, and bringing that poor little girl to relive this. If we're talking about PTSD, you just prolonged the agony of that little child. For what? For your own political gain, your own political purpose. That is despicable.
And I guess he's implicating her parents who wanted her to testify, and she did by video. That was his reaction, Brandon. You, as a survivor yourself, have had to relive it, and I am, will apologize in advance for having you on so much over the years, and you've become one of my favorite people, dearest people. But you've had to relive it, to help other people. What do you make of his take?
Well, first of all, Congressman Biggs is what is despicable and disgraceful. What he just said is appalling and atrocious and a disrespect to that young girl. What I saw today from Mia and from those families was courage. I saw courage from fourth grade students, from kids who just 2 weeks ago were hidden at school disguising themselves with the blood of their own classmates to avoid being shot to death. I saw courage from families who dropped their 10-year-old children off at school only to watch them come out in body bags. I saw more courage today from those families than we have ever seen from Congressman Biggs or the scores of Republicans and Republican-adjacent Democrats who have sat on their hands for decades. I think this is a gut check moment for these politicians and for political leaders across this country. Can you really look in the eyes of those families and tell them nothing can be done? Can you really sit across from those children, from Mia, those traumatized children, and tell them that keeping them safe just isn't a priority for you? Can you really assure us that your obsession with easy access to guns on every corner, that experiment we've been trying forever, is the only answer? Can you continue to tell this country, full of communities like mine that have been ripped apart by gun violence, that the most urgent crises you were elected to solve are teachers with they, them pronouns, drag queens reading Redfish, Bluefish, and history lessons that, God forbid, tell young people this country was built on the backs of enslaved Black people? If the answer to those questions is yes, if you can sit there like Congressman Biggs and leave that hearing room, head back to your office, and phone a gun lobbyist friend for that next fat paycheck, then I have news for you. You are morally bankrupt. You are utterly corrupt, and you are a disgrace to the position you hold. We need action. We don't need political bluster and grandstanding like that. We need political courage. These families deserve it. Children like Mia deserve it. Our entire nation deserves it. They need to get something done.
And it's amen. I mean, these families and this little girl were so brave because they're not speaking out because they enjoy speaking out, Representative Crockett. They're speaking out because they're desperate. People are desperate at this point to have something change. And it's also ahistorical for people like Andy Biggs and the other leaders of your state to pretend that gun reform is alien even to Texas. We found this from the Texas Tribune. This is why 18-year-olds can buy an AR-15 in Texas, but not a handgun. The disparate rules date back to the post-Civil War era, when the state, counter to its modern-day reputation, adopted some of the strictest gun control laws in the nation. Handguns were targeted for gun reform in Texas in the 19th century as weapons that they equated with crime. Rifles and shotguns were excluded because they were used for hunting and participating in a militia. So they saw rifles as the good gun, handguns as the bad guy's gun. But here's the thing. An AR-15 is a rifle. So technically, it gets to be legislated like a shotgun, like a gun you'd go out to hunt birds with. But it ain't a bird hunting gun. Is there any logical explanation why your governor will not simply convene a special session to make that one small change back to Texas's history of gun reform?
Listen, I think where you're going wrong is you're looking for some logic to come up out of Greg Abbott. We have seen over and over and over. I mean, in your intro, what did you talk about? You talked about the things that they called special sessions for. You talked about their priorities. And listen, let me be clear. I don't want anybody to have any questions. The blood of these children is on the hands of the Republicans in the state of Texas, period. No question about it. Because let's talk about who's been in control in the state of Texas for at least the last 30 years. It's been Republicans and their failed policies. And just this session, they decided in the wake of what we saw in El Paso, that what they wanted to do is they wanted to give more access to firearms. Now, this is the same legislature that says 18-year-olds are not mature enough to go ahead and buy a cigarette. So 2 sessions ago, they raised the age from 18 to 21. But in AR-15, which we know you're not doing any real hunting. If you're a real hunter, let me be clear for those that don't understand, you're not hunting. It will destroy your meat. OK, there is no reason for this. And so, honestly, just like what we saw over the summer where we had to go to the federal level to seek some protection as it relates to how rogue the Republicans were acting in the state of Texas, it's the same thing. We need protections. We need an assault ban, period, on the federal level. That is the only thing that's going to put a check on Texas, because Texas doesn't see this as a priority. They could care less about those children. And let me be clear about one other thing. We talk about Buffalo and we talk about the racial component, but nobody is bringing up the fact that this was a school full of brown children. And so I have some questions as it relates to that as well. Would it be different? Because that's the same thing that we saw in El Paso, right? It was brown folk that were targeted. Would it be different if those were not little brown children? Would they care a little more?